Welcome to our second iteration of the podcast. I'm Milo, together here with Frank as usual,
Yeah, that's me.
and today we'll be talking about a completely different topic, something I hadn't expected to be talking about, to be honest, namely the Sbarro restaurant suicide bombing in Jerusalem in 2001.
Quite a different topic, I'd say, yes.
Yes. So. Uh, how much do you already know about this?
Before reading it, I actually hadn't even heard about this bombing.
No,
No.
me neither. But apparently, it's a relatively, let's say, important uh, bombing. So,
Yeah.
for context, this bombing took place in Jerusalem on the 9th of August in 2001, just a short month before 9/11. And it killed 15 civilians, seven of whom were children. And it wounded also quite a few, around 130.
Yeah, that's
So,
quite a lot. I
uh,
would imagine that even for this situation, that is a quite significant attack.
exactly. And the attack was on a Sbarro pizza restaurant. So Sbarro is a international pizza restaurant chain, and they chose to bomb this place. So the attack was conducted by one suicide bomber who was guided by someone else. This someone else, the guide, chose the location, and the location was not chosen because this restaurant chain somehow allowed Israel or whatever to do their evil deeds. It just was the place where they thought they could do the most damage. And while
Yeah,
killing children and even a pregnant woman is generally considered as some pretty severe damage.
that's quite an interesting objective to have from the start. Yeah. And to clarify, the attack was done by a Palestinian in the more general Palestinian-Israel conflict.
Yes, exactly. So it was initially claimed by both Hamas and the Islamic Jihad movement of Palestine, but eventually it was found out it was actually only Hamas who was behind it. Um, and to my surprise, the suicide bomber itself wasn't even that religious. So
Really?
yes,
Huh.
yes, it was a he was a relatively wealthy, or at least he came from a relatively wealthy family, and he was never too interested in religion or in uh, uh, Islam. He
Okay.
simply he used the mosque to as a social activity, just like people use churches to have some social life, not necessarily from
Yeah.
a religious aspect. Um, and then he got recruited by Hamas at some point, um, during which he started expressing some more extremic thoughts, but not necessarily religion based, but more anti-Israel based.
Wow.
Uh, and the same holds true for his guide. So his guide was a woman who is from a uh, Palestinian family who actually fled Palestine slash Israel uh, already about 4 decades before the bombing. They fled to Jordan to kind of live in peace, but she chose to return to study again in Jerusalem. Uh,
Hmm.
but it seems that she always felt some kind of hate towards the Israelis for sending away their family, for stealing their home and stealing their lives which they had in Palestine.
But wait, you said 4 decades before? Was it her family or herself who moved
Her
there for
family, her
decades?
family. So she
Ah,
is
yeah.
not from Jerusalem originally. Her family
No.
was from. I think also not even Jerusalem, but from some Palestinian or former Palestinian territories
Yeah, I see.
in modern day Israel.
Because they were both pretty young, right? The bomber itself and the guide.
Yes, yes, they were about 22 at that time,
Yeah,
which is yeah, I would also say
it's
very
quite
young.
young.
So the bomber itself was actually working in a in a restaurant, I believe, and the um, the guide, the university was a university student
Hmm.
and a part-time journalist. I will try to pronounce some names, but my Arab and my Hebrew are not great. So just to
Yeah.
make the names known. So the suicide bomber was Is al-Din Shuhei al-Masri, and the guide was Tamimi. I'm sorry, Ahmam
Hmm.
Tamimi. Um, so the suicide bomber, he and Tamimi, on the day of the bombing, they both found some excuse to not be there for an hour. So
Whoa. Ah,
the bomber itself just said he was going to do some errands, and the university student just left house saying, "I'm going to some classes." Whereas in fact they were meeting up together and they walked to this place which was chosen by Tamimi, and the
hmm.
goal was just to do as much damage as they could. And uh, the goal, so people want to say that he wasn't actually a suicide bomber. He was just a bomber who happened to die and who knew he was going to die. But the reason why they say it like this is because of the fact that his goal was not to die, his goal was just to do damage as much as he could.
But I don't really see the difference that much. Like it was kind of implied that he would die as well, right? If the bombs are on his body.
Yes, yes, it was very much implied. Um, but they see the difference in this in the fact I would guess because of the fact that it was not a religious argument, so the death wouldn't bring him anything.
Oh
Uh,
yes, it's not for jihad or something like that. Yeah.
no, although in the end uh, he got into Hamas, so he got a little bit more of this religious aspect. It was not his main argument.
Naturally. Yeah.
Um, so he was originally meant to stay outside the restaurant, but last moment, and this was unbeknownst to Tamimi, because Tamimi had already left at this point, he actually went inside the restaurant to and stood close to a family, and this created the largest impact upon explosion. So basically, everyone inside the restaurant close to him would have a huge impact and die with almost certainty.
Yeah.
And those who were uh, not inside the restaurant, they were greatly injured because of the blast coming from inside the restaurant, uh, well,
So
blasting
like people on the
outwards.
street, they were actually injured by still the blast inside. That was a
Yes,
pretty
exactly,
significant
because
one. Yeah.
it was a significant bomb. I believe it was like 10 kilograms of explosives, um, and the well, it injured 130 people. So you can imagine how large
Yeah,
this
that's really
bomb
large.
must have been. Um, and the impact not of the explosion but of the entire event is actually quite significant as well, because they used this specific event as one of the reasons to build the Israeli West Bank barrier. It was
Oh
one
yeah.
of the arguments for constructing it, and one of the reasons Israel sold to. mainly other Western nations, that this was a good idea and a necessary idea because it should stop all the arguments. And one of the things which they said is that what many Israelis thought at that moment was that, yes, it is unfortunate that some Palestinians cannot get to work in time, but this is worth the life of my children.
Yeah, I read that too. Yeah,
And
I
uh,
see.
uh, yes, so the perpetrators, they got caught. Um, the suicide
Oh,
bomber, of course, died, so there's not
yes.
much to be caught. Tamimi was arrested, but only a few weeks later.
How did they even find her? There doesn't
Uh,
seem to be a clear connection between them.
uh, so I am not exactly sure how they found her. I couldn't find that in too much detail, but it seems that they were connected through Hamas, and uh, this
Yeah,
was
uncovered.
somehow information that the
The
Israeli
intelligence
government
service. Yeah.
got.
Hmm.
Um, then she was uh, she was sentenced to life, 16 life sentences, and someone else was actually also arrested. That was Abdallah Barghouti for creating the bombs. He was sentenced significantly longer, namely 67 life sentences, but it was also because he constructed bombs for several other attacks.
For
However,
67 civilians, in fact, so that is correlated, yeah.
yes, exactly. So Tamimi, uh, in the weeks of her freedom, she didn't openly say that she was responsible for this bombing,
I
but
see.
uh, she did talk about it a lot. Uh, but because it was basically the thing to talk about under the Palestinians, and she noted that she was actually very proud of what she did, but the people around her, for example, when she was in the bus, when she heard on the radio the live events happening, or later in the news when she was talking to family or with friends, she always noted how happy everyone was with every additional kill they heard on the radio. So initially they heard there were only like 3 or 4 deaths, and she was kind of disappointed in herself, not showing it to the world, of course, was disappointed. She hoped for more destruction. Um,
Yeah.
but all the Palestinians in the bus apparently were celebrating this. And then when more deaths came in, more the number increased and kept climbing up slowly, she got more expressive. She got happier, and she saw all the Palestinians even partying around the fact that so many people had
Yes.
lost their
E-
lives
Exactly.
in
I
this
um
attack.
I read that quote too, and it was super weird to see this. Just like a random Palestinian bus on, supposed the Palestinian side of Jerusalem. Upon hearing this news, they start cheering, knowing that it is about civilians, about women, about babies. But because they were Jewish or Israeli, they were just having a really good time, and that is such a weird concept to me. Like I can't imagine cheering about that. But these are all uh, normal people, so to say. But through the years of indoctrination, they feel the need to cheer about a random dead Israeli people
So
because of a suicide bomber on their side. It's so weird.
so they actually they see this as the children, they see them as innocent, but they also realize that the children will become the soldiers in the future. And those
Yeah.
soldiers will be the same soldiers who will shoot at them for any arbitrary reason. So they see this as a kind of preventative action, and they see this as preventing further loss of life on their side. That
Yeah.
is their perspective. And this perspective actually goes pretty far. So the suicide bomber actually had a sister, and the sister was pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
On the day or 2 days before the attack, he asked his sister if he were to die a martyr, would she name the baby after him? The sister, of course, didn't realize this attack was being planned. The entire family didn't expect this attack to be planned. They
Yeah.
had no idea. They didn't even know he was part of Hamas. They were actually kind of
Wow.
against Hamas. They
That's
they had
impressive.
no idea.
Yeah.
But then when they found out that he died and he did this suicide bombing, um, well, guess what?
They
This
were
child
probably.
is
Yeah.
actually named after him.
Yeah.
And when journalists asked her about this, and asked her what she had hoped of this baby, she replied that she hoped the baby would follow the footsteps of his uncle,
Yeah, that's crazy. That's really crazy.
not elaborating what that exactly means.
Yeah,
But
but the
yes,
implication is clear. Yeah.
exactly. It's quite clear. The hate for Israel is very strong under these people.
Yeah, I actually watched a little bit of some other news and footage about this, and then I came across a video that showed how some children's shows on Palestinian TV like actively basically indoctrinate children from a young age to hate Israelis. And it's such a crazy thing to see. And of course, with these actions, it's not a surprise that people there hate each other so much.
Yeah, it's quite strange actually.
Yes, yes, I'm pretty sad too.
So to get back to Tamimi,
Yeah, I wanted to ask. She did not serve 16 life sentences, right?
no, actually she did not. She served only about 10 years. She was actually released in a prison exchange. So during her sentence, she was convinced uh, of her righteousness. She
Yeah.
was very happy that with what she done, and she showed no signs of regret whatsoever. And she was happy to serve all these life sentences uh, because she knew that at some point Israel would fall and she would be freed even before the time would be served. Uh, but that's not what happened. Israel is still standing, but she did get released. She got released on a prison exchange. Uh, and this exchange was very controversial. Also in Israel, many of the survivors and family of the survivors actually wrote to the Prime Minister Netanyahu, to not include her in this exchange.
Yeah.
And well, for any for some unknown reason, the prime minister did not listen to this. It could be that he either did not uh, get the message, or that the negotiation on the other side was too strong in favor of this, that they could not get to a deal.
Hmm.
But in any case, Tamimi did get released in this exchange, and she's still alive, living freely in some unknown location.
Yeah, she gave some interviews, right? To show that she actually really doesn't regret anything she did.
Yes, exactly. She is convinced of the righteousness of what she did, and she has no signs of regret whatsoever.
Yeah. But first of all, I think it's pretty odd that these prisoner exchanges can happen, but I mean, they also happen in war, from what I've heard. It's just I looked a little bit into this because I was just quite curious, and she was not the only. It was not like a one-on-one
No, 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 no.
exchange.
It was a prisoners exchange. Prisoners for several other prisoners. She was
No,
just
no,
one name.
exactly. But there was one Israeli soldier, and that was exchanged for 1,400 Palestinian civilians or like prisoners, which was
Yeah,
really crazy to me.
yeah. I mean, the negotiation on the Palestinian side is either very strong, or the Israelis just put a lot of value
The
into their
soldier.
soldiers.
And like, did exchanges like this happen more often?
I believe so. Yes,
Okay.
these exchanges are not uh, extremely rare because of the relatively active fighting and relatively active capturing of each other uh,
Yes.
in this area. It's a mess down there
Oh, it
in
certainly is.
Jerusalem and in the entirety of Israel slash Palestine.
Yes. And I something I wondered, not only about this attack, but in general, when the perpetrator is really focused on killing a specific group of people, I've always wondered how do they know that they don't accidentally attack or kill people from their side, so to say, so like Palestinians? How are they so sure that they are specifically targeting Israelis? Do you know anything about that?
So I don't know this in general, but about this group specifically, they simply targeted a location where they know there would be a lot of Israeli
Yeah,
or tourists.
yeah, I see.
If they hit a Palestinian or someone on their side, they would interpret it as part of the cost of doing business.
Yeah, you can always
So,
twist it in such a way that it sounds good for them, I guess. Yeah,
I
like a
mean, the
martyrdom.
suicide bomber also died.
Yeah,
Of course, he died by choice, and the other Palestinians wouldn't have died by choice. Uh, but they would focus on a place where statistically they would have the highest chance of hitting Israelis
yeah,
and potentially foreigners, and then hope for the best.
yeah, I see.
And in a relatively segregated country like Israel, so far it has worked because they have been going at it, and so far they have. I mean, I wouldn't say success because it's still a suicide bombing, but they've hit their targets and they've done a good amount of damage.
Yes, yes. And about that, I was also wondering, could you give a little bit of like context to this bombing? Like, what was the reason? Was it part of a series of incidents, so to say?
So uh, the bombings in the bombings of done by Israelis had been on the rise already for quite a while.
By Israelis, you mean? So, like,
No, by the
oh, on
bombings
Israelis.
on Israelis
Yeah.
uh, by Palestinians has been had been on the rise.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they call this the Al Aqsa Intifada. Again, excuse my pronunciation.
Mm-hmm.
Where some groups, but mainly Hamas, has been bombing large cities, mainly Jerusalem, but also Tel Aviv, some in the Gaza and some other uh, minor Israeli cities. They've been bombing them since the beginning of, or basically since the end of 2000s. They started
Yes.
some bombings, and they tend to injure quite a lot, kill none or a few. And this was done all in reaction to the increased aggressiveness as perceived by the Palestinians on the segregation and the land stealing and the taking of rights of the Palestinians who saw themselves as natives in this land.
Yes.
Uh, but then the Sbarro suicide bombing itself was not the largest, but definitely one of the largest bombings um, that happened in that year, and that happened in quite a long time. Because before the year 2000, there were some regular bombings, as unfortunately in Israel there always are some regular bombings.
Yes.
But these attacks were relatively limited compared compared to what we saw in the year 2000, sorry, 2001. And these bombings they continued on until roughly 2005, and between 2001 and 2005 they drastically decreased, and from 2005 onwards the number of bombings has been fairly low. The
Yes.
Israeli government thanks this Israeli West Bank barrier as one of the reasons that uh, these bombings have stopped significantly. Um, so yeah, that it is mainly in a reaction to what they perceive as Israeli aggression,
Hmm.
and right now the aggression seems to be relatively calm compared to how it uh, how it was during the main 5 years.
Yes, yes. Like it occasionally comes up in the news for sure. There's some escalation of violence, but I don't recall too many of such bombings in recent years. Certainly not like a full uprising. So yeah, maybe it
No,
stabilized a little bit more, but of course it's definitely not solved, so to say.
in some sense you could say there was a civil war, and right now you have a cold civil war
Hmm.
going on in Israel, which basically has been going on there for the past decades at this
Yes,
point.
yes.
Do you have any insights on how to resolve this this issue?
Well, it's gonna be a boring but nuanced answer, and no, I don't know how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially not as an outsider, considering that it kind of started because of how Britain resolved their the status of this land around the Second World War. They basically promised it to both the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Yes.
And well, it's always a bit tricky when you need to displace some people to put some other people there and give them another country. And it's not too odd that there was some violence after that and some conflicts, but by now it already has been the case for like 70 years. And it
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
sometimes stabilizes, but it's not on the decline. So I think, as an outsider, that one of the reasons why it's still so active is because of the hate that is being told from a very young age to each other, to the other side, so to say. So indoctrination and propaganda, and the fact that both of these sides they just claim to have the right, the religious right to the same place,
Yeah, exactly. This
and
religious right seems to be a very strong argument, in at least for both their perspectives.
yes, and any solution, any like ceasefire or peace solution, I think it will be seen as a defeat to one of the sides, if not both of the sides. You already
Yeah, for
saw that
sure.
I think United Nations developed some plan in the 40s, giving like a two-state solution. Well, Israel accepted it because they didn't have anything before that, but Palestine didn't. And if you have the situation that one of the sides isn't really content with the peace solution, then you're gonna just have another more violence. The peace will not really hold. And what
And
is also problematic, I think, is that well, Israel is a pretty clearly defined state, but Palestina, from what I know, not so much. There was not so much of a Palestinian identity, and as you said, like the attacks were also done by different parties, by different groups, or sometimes by individuals, which makes it difficult to like take responsibility for such actions or to create order and come to like a common solution.
yeah, exactly. So in the case of the interpretation of Israel, they see these attacks uh, done by Palestinians, whether with the approval of the Palestinian government or not, they see it as a responsibility of the Palestinian government because they should have prevented them. So any
Yeah.
of the attacks which happened, they always blame the Palestinian government, whether it was their fault directly or not.
Yeah.
And yeah, of course, as a result, this only makes the conflict much worse because even individuals can uh, create huge tension between the two countries and or well countries. That's of course also quite a controversial statement. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, the it seems to me that the conflict, like it should have been solved 50, 60 years ago, because at that point the Israelis were still kind of new
New.
there, and
Yes.
the Palestinians, like that there was still room for negotiation somehow. And when this two-state solution was proposed and it wasn't fully agreed with, this was the point where it seemed they kind of went with it anyway, and then now they passed this point of no return.
Yeah, I'm not so
But
sure if they passed the point of no return, but I would indeed say like it only becomes more difficult to solve. There is more of a history of hate. Like from the start on, it's difficult to rationalize hating an entire group of people, but over time with all these attacks and the fact that the other side hates you so much because of indoctrination, there's more of a rationalization, so to say, to indeed say like we cannot accept peace. We have to resort to extremism, and we cannot
if it's
have like a good discussion about this anymore. So,
if it's all you've heard your entire life that the other people are bad, and on top of that you see attackings being done by the other people on some of your cities, of course you will believe that they are the devil.
it's
Um,
difficult to overcome that, yes, but
it's incredibly difficult.
if it's based on hate, it's not gonna be solved. I feel like both of these factions, Israeli and Palestinians, are, so to say, strong enough, either because there are just a lot of them or because they have external support, that they cannot completely destroy the other side, which is, I don't think, an ideal solution either. So if
Ideal not, but it would have been a solution. Far from ideal.
historically that is usually what happens when two states really cannot stand each other, but I don't think that's realistic even. Not even to mention desirability. But
Hmm.
yeah, even like the terrorism part, it only increases hate. I don't think you really achieve much with it, except a lot of sadness and a lot of extra hate. You cannot defeat the other side by killing a few dozen civilians. You just create a lot of problems with it.
Oh no, for sure you can't, because like you said, you create more hate, and by doing that you create more people on the other side who will want to attack you, and then attacking the other basically comes back in your face. But on the other hand, if you are there in that moment and someone attacks you and you don't do anything back, it seems like you
A
are
si-
giving up or
exactly,
you're not.
a sign of weakness
So,
almost. Yeah.
exactly. So you're in this dilemma of fighting back or doing nothing, because those seem like the two most straightforward options. Either you fight or you don't,
Yes.
and both of them result in something severely undesirable. So there should be some third option, either in between those that you attack but in a lighter degree, or you do something completely different, which which is where the answer to some long-term solution lies.
Hmm.
But some top-down negotiations seem to seem to not work because whatever they decide, either one of the parties will lose, and maybe their governments will be okay with it, but the people will not.
No, no, exactly. And it is an issue. I think like the best way right now is just to keep the status quo, which is tense, but at least there's no huge scale conflict. And then hopefully tensions will de-escalate over the years. You already see that in the governments themselves are usually willing to negotiate or to discuss. And as long as the hate decreases a little bit over time, then there's also less reason to create more hate, so to say. But it can easily escalate again. And when I was thinking about it, I was comparing it to other situations in the world where two groups of people really, really dislike each other, like the Armenians and the Azerbaijani, or the Ukrainians and the Russians right now. And it's gonna take a long time for that to stop.
Oh yeah, it will take at least a generation to get over that hate, probably longer,
Yeah, I would
for sure.
expect like the duration of the current conflict, that is also going to be the duration of de-escalating it again, which is going to be a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Yeah,
just think it's very sad in all these situations that the cause of this hate is usually some powerful person, head of state, some organization who, for some reason, finds it important to direct the hate towards the other side. And in the case of Palestine and Israel, it was gonna be difficult from the start to find a peaceful solution.
it was
But
going to be very difficult from the start.
there, right now, it's in the interest of the people in power to maintain that hate, so to say. And ordinary people and civilians are uh, they have some, yeah, they cannot live their ordinary lives anymore, and that's I
I
think
mean,
very sad.
just as the hate of one party towards the other feeds the hate in the other direction, the leaders and the people also feed the hate to each other. Because if a leader starts to verbally or physically attack some other side, and he can sell that to his people, then the people will vote for him, which will in turn re reaffirm his actions, and
Yes.
you will see that this hate kind of, if you have a scapegoat, then as a leader you're relatively safe in terms of re-election or uh, your power stability. So just as well as these parties hate for each other feeds their hate for them, yeah, for the other party, but in the other direction, uh, their hate internally is also fed by their leaders and
Yes.
the people themselves.
And I think that is a pretty large issue when you think about it. Like, it is so advantageous for the leaders to be hateful, to be aggressive, to be extremist in this case, compared to being like rational and open to discussion. That it is kind of like an outward spiraling situation. It will be very difficult to get back to a more peaceful situation.
And it almost seems from this perspective that the only solution is somehow some foreign intervention who doesn't have hate for either of the parties. But this entire conflict started by somehow some foreign intervention.
Yeah,
So
historically speaking, foreign intervention has not been very good in long-term
no, exactly,
solutions.
exactly. But then you would need some internal person or group who doesn't have hate for the other and who is somehow trusted by both parties. And this seems almost impossible.
Right now, I would say yes. Hopefully, in the future, things could change. Already, it's a good sign that like this wave of bombings and insurgency is more than 20 years ago. So we are already not on the peak anymore. But to be fair, I don't know about enough about the situation to really be able to judge like is it going in the right direction or not.
No, exactly.
And
But I mean, you. Oh yeah,
oh yeah,
please.
in the end, it's I think it's important that the solution comes from within indeed, and not from outsiders who think, okay, it's enough, let's fix this. It's not that
Yeah,
easy.
no, exactly. The because the power every individual has in this conflict, in the fact that they can do a suicide bombing, for example, you need only a very small amount of people to organize a suicide bombing. You want not that there is some formal agreement, but you want the agreement to be within the people. It was a
Mm-hmm.
cultural agreement because if the agreement is not shared among everyone, there will be some uprise or some attack, and then it can escalate very quickly.
Exactly.
So it's clear that the solution should come from within, and that the solution should be shared by all. Um, but this seems very tough and not something that can happen in a short amount of time.
No, no, absolutely not. I think the best now is to not be fueled by hate. Be aware of the situation. Be aware that even though the other side is probably indoctrinated, they are still human, and be open to discussion. But it's easier said than done.
What do you think uh, other governments, Western governments, but also of anywhere around the world, should do about the recognition of, um, well, Palestine, but also, for example, the Arab states, the recognition of Israel?
Yeah, that is also a pretty touchy point, of course, because as far as I
Sure
know,
is.
most Western countries only recognize Israel and support Israel, and are not as clear about Palestina, like they may be also not as clear about Taiwan. Um, it's tricky. I don't think it is very good to just ignore Palestina, so to say. But even the topic about where the borders are is very controversial idea. So not completely sure about that one.
Yeah, so it seems that most countries in the world, except the West, recognizes uh, Palestine,
Yeah.
and most countries in the world, except the Arab world, recognizes
Okay,
Israel.
that gives some important context actually.
So countries, I believe China, Russia, India, and Brazil, I believe they recognize both.
Yes.
Uh, Sweden, strangely enough, also recognizes both.
Okay.
But Canada, the US, and most Western European nations recognize only Israel, just like you kind of would expect from uh, this historic view. Uh, so there's actually already a large part of the world, I would even say the majority of the world, already recognizes
Okay. That's very good to know.
both countries.
And in the end, while the resolution from the United Nations might have not been perfect, they do recognize both parts as independent from each other, so to say. And considering that I think the solution doesn't lie in completely destroying the other side, I would say it's a good idea to recognize that the other side is going to stay there, and you might not become
Exactly.
one, in general. So probably it would be a good idea for both Arab states to recognize Israel in some sort, and the Western world Palestine in some sort. Maybe not fully. Yeah, I don't really know what to say about that, but I guess there are like
I
gradations in there in that aspect.
I would say that they should recognize both countries as legitimate countries and then disapprove of the actions you disapprove of. So, for example, it's quite well known that the US supports Israel to a very large extent, which also means that they disapprove of Hamas and the actions taken by Palestine.
Yes,
But I think that it would be best for them to recognize Palestine and then condemn them, denounce them, and then diplomatically try to put them down because they disagree with the suicide bombings, they disagree with all this and all that. But Palestine has some land, and that land is recognized as Palestine. Even Israel knows Gaza is not Israeli; that is it is Palestinian.
exactly.
Uh, so call this Palestinian sovereign territory, call Palestine a sovereign state, and then just condemn that state as much as you want. But at least it is a state, so you can talk with it, and you recognize that whatever happens, it will be done through these parties.
It's
You have someone to talk
it's
to.
better to ignore it, than to ignore it, indeed. The issue with that a little bit is that, well, first of all, in politics it's always a bit more difficult than it sounds
Oh
like,
yeah, for sure.
because
There's some nuanced things going on here
I
which
think a few years
I'm
ago,
skipping over.
Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem and not Tel Aviv as the capital of Israel, and that already caused
Yes.
a huge uproar. Um, and considering also that most Western countries don't really want to see Taiwan as an independent country, even though it's a very cold war, so to say, between Taiwan and mainland China, so to say. So annoyingly, it just is very difficult to really make decisions on that part. And unfortunately,
How?
also for most countries, it's not that interesting to do business with Palestina, considering it's not a state in a very good state, so to say. It's because of all this war and problems.
Yeah,
It's very
it's
poor,
severely
no
impoverished,
infrastructure.
and
It's a mess.
yeah, it's a huge mess. But I mean, there's other countries which are also a mess, which are also recognized by most other countries. I mean, South Sudan, for example, has been a mess ever since it started being
That's yeah, no, it's
something,
true.
yet
It's true.
almost the entire world recognizes it because, I mean, it's less politically mm, provocative to recognize South Sudan because their split up with Sudan was relatively on good terms. Uh, well, the split up of Israel and Palestine is, well, as we just discussed, not on good terms at
Yep.
all. So I suppose it's easier to recognize South Sudan, but in terms of their business incentives or whatsoever,
There's just as
there's
little.
not much difference. I would say,
No,
yeah,
exactly. And the main reason why this topic is avoided is because it's a touchy subject and it's just easier to not say too much about it, which I don't think is a very good approach, but well, it's often used.
yeah. But because if you're not talking too much about it, then the status quo will remain intact. And although the status quo, as it is right now, is not so bad as it has been, it's still not
No,
good because there's still a lot of people suffering, and it's still relatively unsafe in this part of the world. Um,
exactly. And the fact that indeed so many people are suffering because of that, it's unfortunate that so many countries don't really care about that too much. And that they are so often biased about it. You see, sometimes there's like demonstrations in Western countries for support for Palestine, so to say, to condemn the actions that Israel does. And I
oh
don't
yeah,
like
they happen on a daily
exactly, they
basis
happen
here.
very often. I think it's unfortunate that most people seem to condemn like the violence of one side, while both sides have done quite a lot of violence and quite a lot of war crimes. And that is what bothers me, so to say.
You mean the hypocrisy,
Well, that
or
also, but the fact that these actions happen so often, like I'm not so sure. Like I don't want to pick a side, also because I don't know enough about this topic, because there's a lot to say. I just don't like the amount of violence done by both sides. Uh,
oh yeah, and how normal it seems to
exactly.
be. I mean, I've got some friends who left Palestine a long time ago, and some friends who are still living in Israel, and both of them seem so. I mean, both of those people seem unsatisfied by the safety situation as it is, but it seems so absolutely normal to them that oh, another attack had happened. Oh, and that's
It's super sad that
almost
people
a,
have to live that life. Yeah, that this is a normal situation. Well, okay, it's not easy, but it sounds preventable, so to say. It's
it does
yeah,
sound it sounds so preventable. But on the other hand, the I mean, you just referred back to the Russian-Ukraine
exactly.
conflict. Sounds also preventable, but there's so many nuances going on in such a conflict that is.
Of course. Like in the end, many things are theoretically preventable, but well, it's very difficult to put in practice.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Because of all the interests of the individuals which are at play and which are so hard to control and so hard to all take into account. But if there is no compromise, then there will not be a solid future for anyone.
Hmm. To get back to another point, to wrap this up a little bit, I was wondering how the Sbarro restaurant is doing right now.
Ah, um, Fun that you ask. The Sbarro restaurant left. It became a normal cafe right now, and apparently it's doing okay. Yeah, nothing too special.
That's good.
You can even visit it on Google Maps, Google Street View, and it's it seems super ordinary. The people there seem not to care, or maybe even not be aware of what happened in that place. It's just some ordinary restaurant at this
I
point.
think that's the best option. Like, of course, this shouldn't be forgotten, and the people who lost family members here or something, they will definitely forget it. But to have like a memorial at this restaurant, that creates associations for a very long time. So, uh,
Yeah, exactly. It seems a bit too much. But if you're ever in town, just go to the crossing of King George Street and Jaffa Street, or King George Street continues to Nathan Strauss Street, and find the cafe with the curved window, and then you can enjoy a coffee in a place where about 20 years ago some terror had happened.
mhm.
If that's anything, if that's something you're into.
Where you should not go to is An Naja University in the West Bank city of Nablus. 20 years ago, they had an exhibit. It's a Palestinian university, and they recreated the scene of the bombing, including broken furniture and human body parts, which was not really
Oh,
seen as a very nice gesture, so to say. But the Palestinian students were kind of proud of it. It was closed.
yeah, this
It's weird,
I can imagine.
really weird.
This pride of the people of the terror they inflict on the others is still baffling.
Absolutely.
Something I will probably never understand in my life.
No,
But
like I'm happy that I cannot understand it properly, so to say, that our situation is so peaceful in a way.
yeah, that we live in the luxury of boredom.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's it on our story on the Sbarro restaurant suicide bombing of 2001, and our adjacent discussion on the two-state solution
Yes,
of the Israeli-Palestine
I feel
conflict.
like we
Um,
covered the article, but there's one question left to ask. How would you rate the article?
oh, yeah, of course, of course. So the article is quite extensive. I mean, there's definitely longer articles, but it's well sourced, and most information you would want to know about this can be found in here. And if not in here, the sources are, like I said, extensive. Uh, so generally, it's well structured. It's just good introduction, then just a short story about the attack with some quotes. If you want to find information on the perpetrators, it's there. If you want to see what kind of effects it had on the future of Palestine and Israel, it's there. And the information on prisoner exchange or what happened to the attackers, it's also there. Um, it's a bit unfortunate that it isn't available in so many languages. Uh, that's kind of takes away some points, um, and uh, they could have added, I suppose, a slightly mm, the location could have been a bit better informed, I guess, but that's not. That's relatively minor. Overall, it was very interesting to read. I learned a lot. I really hadn't. I didn't really know so much about this specific bombing or in general about terrorist attacks in
Hmm.
Israel. So I think I rated a 4 stars. I rated 4 stars.
Okay, okay. I largely agree about your thoughts. I think it's definitely like extensive information about the specific attack. And what I specifically like is that well, there of course many of these attacks have happened. So if you just read 10 of them, then you're gonna see 10 times relatively similar information. What makes it a little bit more personal are the quotes, even though they are pretty horrible to read sometimes, because either they depict the
Yes.
scene quite vividly or they depict the thought process of the terrorists. I do think it's important to add this personal element and make you realize that this is an event where 13 people, 15 people died and 130 are wounded. So for many of these people, it's a very personal event. And
Yeah, it de-abstractizes kind of the entire concept of a suicide bombing.
exactly. And these quotes make it significantly less dry, even though more difficult to read. I think it's very important that they are here. And well, even though it's kind of course, a sad article, I would also give it 4 stars.
Great. Then 4 stars for the Sbarro restaurant suicide bombing. For
It's the best one
pizza pies.
so far.
Best best one so far. Yeah, but we've only had two, so
Yes, there gonna be better ones.
perhaps the next one can be better. Up to the next one.
Exactly. See you next week for in 2 weeks. Come on, come on, 2 weeks for another article, and it's probably gonna be an entirely different subject again. It's
Let's hope so. I'm happy. I'm looking forward to something a bit more joyful than the Israeli-Palestine conflict, suicide bombings, whatever.
yeah, that's enough bombings, I think, for now.
All right. See you next time.
See you next time.